Supervisor Melgar?
Aye.
Melgar, aye. You have 3 ayes.
Okay, that motion passes. Thank you so much. Let's go to item number 2, please, Madam Clerk.
Item number 2 is a hearing on the evictions in the city's permanent supportive housing project-based sites that receive city funds and efforts to prevent and reduce evictions at PSH sites, and requesting the listed departments to report. Members of the public who wish to provide public comment on item number 2 should call the number 415-655-0001. The meeting ID today is 2482-057-2196. Then press pound and pound again. And if you would like to speak, you just need to press *3. Madam Chair?
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Supervisor Preston, thank you for introducing this item and for your leadership on this issue. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Melgar, and thank you for calendaring this item today. I know we have a lot of agenda items and appreciate you making space for this conversation today. So today we'll be examining an issue that I think we can all agree is one of very high importance, and that is the displacement of some of the most vulnerable San Franciscans who live in city-funded permanent supportive housing, often referred to as PSH. For some context on this, my office was approached late last year after the redistricting that brought a lot of supportive housing into District 5. I was approached by residents of SROs, including members of the Tenderloin People's Congress, with serious concerns about evictions in the city's PSH portfolio. They asked our office to create a space to elevate their stories and to scrutinize the causes and practices regarding evictions in city-funded supportive housing, and that's the genesis of the hearing today. Over the last few months, my office has met with a broad range of stakeholders to better understand the issue and some of the obstacles and challenges here. You will hear from some of these folks today, both in presentations and I assume in public comment as well. We've met with tenant leaders and individual PSH residents, PSH providers, tenant attorneys, as well as city departments, including Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, the Department of Public Health, and the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development. So I know they will go into some more detail during their respective presentations, but I wanted to at least kick things off with a few thoughts on some of the big issues that I've seen from the engagement with stakeholders over the last couple months. First, I want to note that while I think we all recognize that there's a range of reasons that a provider pursues eviction against a PSH tenant, there is no reason in this supervisor's opinion why anyone, PSH or in other housing right now, should be losing their homes because of non-payment of rent during this moment. We have tens of millions of dollars in San Francisco in unspent rent relief money. We should figure out how to get those funds, in this case, to the PSH tenants or to the providers to cover the rent arrears that are during COVID. So I just want to, at the outset, isolate that type of eviction, and looking forward to hearing some solutions on that front, and also just making sure that we are not having non-payment evictions moving forward while this COVID state of emergency remains in effect. Second, in terms of broader themes here, we hear from many tenants in supportive housing that question the sufficiency of the support that comes with supportive housing. And the results of what is seen as a lack of support, reducing the quality of life for tenants in our SROs, and at times resulting in evictions that would otherwise be preventable with greater support for tenants. So we want to hear from providers about their efforts to support struggling tenants, to avoid eviction and to avoid problematic behaviors, and what the city can do to improve this critical aspect of our supportive housing programs. We also want to better understand what programs are provided by DPH in particular to provide mental and behavioral health support. Third, and certainly related to what I just mentioned, we understand that coordinated entry has given providers less visibility and discretion in who is placed in their buildings, and has left providers, and we've heard this from many different providers, feeling unprepared to some extent, or ill-equipped to adequately support tenants, particularly with increasing acuity of some of the issues that they are dealing with because of that change several years ago to coordinated entry. So what steps can we take to improve the transition into PSH, as some refer to it, the handoff of someone who is being placed in supportive housing. So those are just a few of what I think are the bigger themes I hope to touch on today. I want to recognize this is a complex issue. We are not going to have a 5-hour hearing to really get into the details of each of these things. I view this hearing as, it's not a starting point, it's not an end point. It's kind of a midpoint in a conversation that is happening, that our office has been facilitating and others have facilitated before our office. So it's more of a midpoint in that conversation, not an end point. And but we also want to be conscious to be hearing from all stakeholders, and in particular making sure that PSH tenants are part of that discussion, or at the table, not just as one of the presenters today, but also in terms of having this discussion not just behind closed doors, but in a public hearing where tenants can listen, tune in, and weigh in. So before I turn it over to the presenters, let me say this one last thing. I want to underscore that the critical importance of this city's PSH program and of supportive housing in our city. The city has done important work to expand the PSH portfolio, particularly during COVID, seizing some opportunities to acquire buildings, to create new SROs. And this has provided some of those vulnerable San Franciscans with a place to live. This is a crucial part of our city's affordable housing portfolio, providing a much-needed exit from homelessness for many San Franciscans. But that's why it's all the more critical that we make sure we're keeping people stably housed in PSH sites with the support they need, preventing displacement, improving the quality of life for folks living in supportive housing, and preventing a return to homelessness, which I hope is a shared goal. So with that, Chair Melgar, we have 3 presentations. I'm going to ask all presenters, so you don't have to ask them. I'm going to ask that they all be as brief as possible, given that I'm sure we'll have questions for them. They are first, my understanding is that the departments are going to present together. They have a single presentation that will be led by Emily Cohn, Deputy Director at HSH, and Dara Papo, DPH, from DPH, and then staff from OCD is available for questions as well. So they'll kick it off. I asked them to limit their presentation to 10 minutes, followed by a presentation from the providers, which will be given by Lauren Hall, the Executive Director of DISH, on behalf of the Supportive Housing Providers Network. And then lastly, a presentation from the tenant perspective from an SRO tenant, Cheryl Shanks, and so for both the provider and the tenants, I asked that each of their presentations be 5 minutes. So hopefully 10 minutes from departments, and 5 from providers, and 5 from tenants. So can we kick off with Deputy Director Cohen? Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having us, all of us. I'm Emily Cohen, Deputy Director at the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, and really appreciate Supervisor Preston calling this hearing. As you said, this is an incredibly important topic to all of us working in the homeless response system. I will do my best to keep it brief. There is a lot of content here. My colleague, Bryn Miller, is trying to share the slides remotely, so if she could be granted access, that would be great. I'll start with some brief context about what the different departments' role is in permanent supportive housing and the context of the size and scope of the portfolio. So for awareness, the city has approximately 9,500 units of project-based permanent supportive housing across 157 buildings. So a really significant portfolio serving over 10,000 households every year. The Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing funds nonprofits for property management and social services at each of these sites. We jointly administer the Emergency Rental Assistance Program with MOHCD, which we'll discuss later in the program. We coordinate services with other departments to provide support to tenants, provide some direct services ourselves, and manage the referral and placement process into supportive housing. Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development, as mentioned before, co-administers the ERAP program, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, funds right to counsel, and obviously funds and develops supportive and affordable housing. And then we partner very closely with the Department of Public Health on health and physical and behavioral health services within PSH. For HSH's portion of the presentation, I'm going to focus on 3 areas: data, navigating the eviction process, and steps to improving housing retention. The goal of permanent supportive housing is to provide vulnerable tenants with stable homes for the long term, to ensure that they have both the affordability and the on-site social services needed to remain stably housed in their community. San Francisco has been very successful at doing this. Not only do we have the largest number of permanent supportive housing units per capita in the nation, we also have a 97% stability rate for the first year that someone's in permanent supportive housing, and an 87% stability rate after 2 years, well above the 80% national average within supportive housing. Our local data shows that over the last 5 years, we've seen a steady reduction in evictions out of supportive housing. Obviously, the COVID eviction moratoriums show a really significant drop there during that time. But just last year alone, there were 142 evictions out of the nearly 11,000 households that were served in PSH. So we're looking at 1.29% eviction rate across 146 sites that were included in this report. We report this data annually to the Board of Supervisors. So the process leading up to an eviction, this is slightly different provider by provider, as the nonprofit is the leaseholder with the tenant, but we manage this process and we monitor this process through data collection and regular conversations with the providers. And the process that I'm showing here is a sample from DISH, so thank you to DISH, but it is pretty indicative of what the experience would be like in supportive housing. So it starts with informal reminders when there is a lease violation, whether that's a behavioral health or non-payment. The providers take multiple steps to engage and support the tenant to address the issue. When there are concerns about non-compliance with the lease, the provider will issue written letters, have conversations with the residents, and raise the concerns to HSH during our regular check-in meetings. The second step is the lease violation notice, which is a written notice distributed to the resident. The reasons for these notices can be varied, anything from non-payment of rent, housekeeping or inspection violations, or other nonviolent violations. The third step, if we go to the next slide, is the post-lease violation conversation. So after the formal written notice is given, there is hopefully a discussion with the tenant and coordination between the property management and support service providers to problem solve that particular tenant's challenges. And supportive services works really closely with the tenants to try to avoid, at this point, getting into an eviction process. If no agreement or change can be reached, at this point, a 10-day notice would be served, but there are multiple attempts made well prior to this to avoid getting to this point. And once that 10-day notice is issued, that legal process begins. and legal aid is consulted at that point and connected with the tenant. And then the process goes to court, where either there'll be a settlement agreement that the tenant can hopefully continue their residency or their tenancy, and if not, then eviction might go forward, which is, of course, the rare exception to the norm. So now I want to shift and talk a little bit about what the department has done to improve housing retention across our system. One is investments in services. We know, as the supervisor mentioned, the acuity of our tenants in permanent supportive housing has grown over the years recently. We've seen a higher needs community moving into supportive housing from a behavioral, physical health perspective, age perspective. And so we made significant investments to enhance social services in last year's budget. This includes lifting the base wage for case managers to $28 an hour and investing $12 million to bring up the wages of frontline workers in supportive housing. We've also invested in service enhancements, $32.4 million over 2 years to reduce the client to case manager ratio, the case manager to client ratio, to ensure better services for the tenants. We have implemented the cap on 30% of income, so tenants are now, no tenant in PSH is paying more than 30% of their income towards rent. And big shout out to Jordan and all the tenants for their great work to get that done. We've also added case management staff and have invested $5 million in improving infrastructure. The second big change that we've made to improve housing retention is the warm handoff that Supervisor Preston was talking about in the beginning, or in his opening remarks. And this is through our new housing placement team. During the COVID pandemic, the Shelter-in-Place Hotel, as everyone knows, stood up 2,500 shelter rooms over, in a very, very rapid period, and then had to wind them down, which was even more challenging, I think, than standing them up. And we started a SIPRI housing team that was dedicated to working very closely with the providers, the housing navigators, and the tenants on the housing referral and placement process. We have decided to keep this team coming out of the SIP process and have made them now a permanent part of our housing work, our new housing placement team. And the idea is to really improve and provide much more support during the placement process, both for the future tenant, the provider, for the future tenant and the provider, as well as the housing navigator, who's doing a lot of the work to make that placement happen. And then the third area on our, to improve retention has been really focused on partnerships. We know that we need more support from outside departments to support our tenants. So really working closely with the Department of Disability and Aging to support our tenants in PSH through an in-home supportive service program that is now spread to over 66 sites, started as a pilot last year, but to really increase IHSS support to PSH tenants, many of whom were eligible before but not getting that support, and this has really been helpful in stabilizing people, especially older population who is, we really want to help them age in place. And also a really expansive partnership with the Department of Public Health, and they will come up in a minute and talk more about all of our partnerships, but really site-based nursing, advanced clinical services, roving case management, and overdose prevention are all provided by DPH in supportive housing. And the final partnership is the Home Safe program, which is a partnership with Adult Protective Services to provide enhanced case management. The non-payment of rent guidelines is the final change we have made. And this is really, coming out of the pandemic, we saw a real challenge of tenants not paying their rent. Now, if somebody loses their income, their contribution can be adjusted based on their income. However, we saw many tenants opting not to pay rent at all, which puts the providers in a very hard place financially. And so we have issued rent guidelines that do support the providers and tenants in setting a norm and a baseline for paying rent. My last slide is about the role of prevention, and this is the partnership with MoCD. And just to be very quick about it, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program during the COVID response We had just over 2,000 PSH tenants take advantage of this program, leveraging just under $4 million in rent arrears that effectively wiped the slate clean for those tenants and really offers an opportunity to stabilize their housing going forward, and we'll continue to partner with MoCD on this program going forward. I'll turn it over to Dara Papo from DPH.
Thank you. And before she gets started, I was going to hold all questions, but just wanted to clarify really quickly, the team you mentioned that's going to be kept in place to do both Housing Navigator and placement, like how many people is that? Or how many FTEs?
I think let me check, and
Okay.
I will answer your question.
Great. And here's the other one, and
Yeah.
maybe you could check on this too. Thank you for giving us on the last slide the $3.96 million so far paid to the providers on behalf of tenants who couldn't make rent. Do we know what the outstanding balance as we sit here and discuss this today is in terms of unpaid rent?
I don't. It doesn't look like my
I
colleagues
will
from
ask
OCD
the providers
either,
network
but-
as well, but if someone can get an answer during this hearing, that would be great. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Dara Papo. I'm here with the San Francisco Department of Public Health. I think if we can go to the next slide. Maybe. Did we lose the slides? Here we go. I am also here with my colleague Elise Miller, who will be available if there are follow-up questions at the end. I'm going to be talking about 4 different ways that the health department partners with the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing to support health and housing retention for PSH tenants. The first program we're going to talk about was created in part because most PSH tenants do not live in buildings that have on-site health services included. And so the FACS, Permanent Housing Advanced Clinical Services, was set up, and it is a mobile team consisting of health and behavioral health staff. It began about a year ago and is funded through Proposition C. FACS has now been expanded to 69 buildings, which house over 5,000 tenants. The program will be scaling up to serve all PSH tenants. Risk of eviction is one reason why tenants can be referred to the FACS program, along with other health-related issues. And there are 3 goals of FACS. The first one is to provide consultation and capacity building for HSH on-site services staff around working with tenants with physical or behavioral health issues and connecting them to care. The second one is the opportunity to provide short and stabilizing care during the process of attempting to link individuals to community resources. And third, FACS can provide ongoing in-home direct services, both medical care and behavioral health care, for individuals who are having challenges connecting to services in the community. So again, FACS is serving over half the PSH buildings and is working to scale up to serve all of them. We can go to the next slide. As Emily had mentioned, we also have nurses by DPH in 11 of HSH's PSH sites, which serve almost 900 tenants. Staffing ranges from a part-time to a full FTE nurse who works closely with on-site HSH support services. The goal is to work with individuals with health-related needs, and DPH and HSH are partnering closely together, in part the placement team that Emily mentioned, to ensure that individuals with the more acute health-related issues are able to be placed in the buildings that have these on-site nurses. And the services of the site-based nurses include care coordination, support around medication adherence, as well as direct nursing care. If we can go to the next slide. Through the Behavioral Health Department of DPH, there's funding for 2 streams that support permanent supportive housing. There's funding for an on-site case management and crisis intervention services in HSH-funded buildings, and state funding through the Mental Health Services Act that provides on-site support services in HSH-funded buildings for adults with serious mental illness. And if we can go to the next slide, there's two additional DPH programs that we're going to talk about. One is the citywide roving team, which provides physical and behavioral health care for tenants in 28 HSH-funded PSH sites, a number of which are referred to citywide services due to an impending risk of eviction. And DPH's overdose prevention programs support training for PSH staff, access to naloxone, and support for tenants to access medications for addiction treatment, as well as specific support for individuals that have survived an overdose. These four programs are examples of ways that DPH works to support HSH tenants across our continuation of services. This care often starts when individuals might be seen by DPH staff when they're on the streets or in shelters, includes warm handoffs to staff that work from DPH in these HSH-funded sites, either through site-based services or mobile services. And there's a lot of work done by HSH and DPH staff to help PSH tenants get connected to community services, including outpatient care, intensive case management services, and residential treatment to support health and housing retention for HSH tenants. And I believe the next slide is for questions.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have questions, but I think we're going to proceed with the other presentations first. So next, from the provider's perspective, I want to invite up Lauren Hall. Welcome, Ms. Hall.
Do you mind inviting my co-chair, Tremesia Garner?
Absolutely. You are
Thank
so
you.
welcome.
Thank you
Please
very
come
much,
on up.
Supervisor. Thank you. Come on up. Come on, we sing duets better
Through
than
the
we
chair,
go
both
solo.
mics work right here, the laptop one and the
See, there you go.
lectern.
All right. We have a PowerPoint. I don't know if it's going to be pulled up or if I should.
It takes a couple seconds. Just
Oh,
give us a second.
great.
And you'll see it appear on the television.
Well, so
now.
I'll just start. Again, I'm Lauren Hall, co-chair of the Supportive Housing Provider Network. I also operate DISH, Delivering Innovation Supportive Housing, which is a property management organization with 9 supportive housing buildings in the city. Just quickly about the network, we really our goal as a network is to work with our sister supportive housing providers to kind of address challenges that we're all seeing, try to inform policy, and really help the city shape the supportive housing program so that it works best for the residents that we serve. We currently have membership about 15 agencies representing the bulk of supportive housing in San Francisco. And I will just say that kind of our challenge with this topic is really that we think there are solutions out there, but that we really need to figure out how in San Francisco to create collaborative solutions that serve that small number of residents who are not successful in supportive housing. I think all of us that are housing providers spend a lot of energy and, that's really where we spend most of our work, is trying to ensure that the housing that we have and the services that we provide meet the needs of our residents. However, I think that it can be really challenging given just the pressures that we're under, the things that we've been talking about. And so at times, the use of the lease and the enforcement of that lease, it's really there to ensure that people can have quiet enjoyment of the residence that they live in per their lease, that people can have the support they need, and that our staff can be in a safe work environment. And so I think for us, starting that unlawful detainer process really is the last resort. We are loath to use that costly process, and I feel like we typically work for months, in some cases even years, with residents to try to engage them in resolving housing retention challenges. And clearly something is still not working for a portion of folks that we serve. And so I'm really excited to learn today from people with lived experience, residents in supportive housing, with other ways that they think that we can be working collaboratively, but really hoping that if you could go to slide 3, that would be great. Or I don't know how to drive it from here. Sorry. Thank you. There you go. Thank you so much. Because I think, eviction is a blunt and costly tool to address an incredibly complex challenge, and it's in an under-resourced environment. And so at the end of the day, the people that suffer are the residents who are evicted. And so it's our job, I think, as providers and as a community to really be able to solve those issues and debrief the challenges we're having and find new solutions that can work for everybody that we're trying to serve. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the main things that we're seeing, try to offer a couple of ideas around solutions, and then we'll turn it over to the residents who are going to follow us. So I think, as you mentioned, if you can go to the next slide, please, around non-payment of rent. I think we all agree that in a city like this, we really don't want to see anyone losing their housing over non-payment of rent. I know that in my former program, when it was under DPH, we had sort of a mandatory third-party rent payee service that was offered. We never saw non-payment of rent evictions, and I'm afraid that now we're certainly seeing with, I don't know if it's the sort of post-COVID, it feels like there's a sort of a culture of non-payment of rent that's really been established. A lot of folks who are living in the shelter-in-place hotels who did not have to pay rent and were provided with a lot of great services like food security and housekeeping and a lot of intensive overdose prevention. As they've moved into permanent housing, I think it's been a difficult transition for people. And so I think that we're seeing a much higher rate of non-payment of rent, certainly speaking for my organization and my peers, than we've ever seen. And so as you mentioned, Supervisor Preston, the burden of us being funded by rental income and then not receiving that, it's sort of the way that supportive housing is designed. And so if the city would like to approach that in a different way, that's something that we need to talk about collectively, is how we actually would work with that. And so I think we have thought about, and we worked very closely with MoCD and HSH on the ERAP program, how do we make this program as easy as possible to access? We had a number of meetings really trying to make it not burdensome so that residents didn't have to jump through a lot of hoops. I think we made pretty decent progress there, but there still was sort of, I'm sorry, I'm going to finish this slide, but at any rate, I think that there's more that we can do there. I think we also really need to increase the ability for residents to get money management support. I know that HSH is considering that in their budget ask this year, but for a lot of folks who are unaccustomed to paying rent and are living on a very limited income, I think that support can really be a huge benefit. And lastly, I think we need to engage in a broader conversation about, do we really expect that someone can pay 30% of their income when they're living on, $400 or $500 a month? Maybe we can invest in food security or other ways that people can get actually their needs met. I'm going to pass it on to my co-pilot here, and I'm hoping you're going to get another couple minutes to cover our last piece.
Yes, Ms. Garner, please.
Thank
if
you
you
very
have
much.
something to add, please go ahead.
So I'll talk briefly. There were a couple of slides left after, but I don't know if you have time to put them back up. But a couple of things we also wanted to highlight were issues around violence and aggressive behavior within supportive housing as another reason why we're seeing folks unfortunately lose their housing, in addition to extreme cluttering behaviors, and which can oftentimes lead to pest control issues. So I know Emily talked about the investment in supportive services that's happening. That is new. That is going to take some time to ramp up. As many folks know, we have issues and struggles around hiring within our portfolio of housing due to low wages. So I think if we can continue to invest in wages within the staffing, so that way tenants aren't seeing new folks every time they turn around, that is one of the key drivers, because you can't have stable housing and case management if your case manager changes every 6 months. So we really need to look at where we invest our dollars and how we do so in a way that is supportive of the tenants that we're here to serve, so that way folks can remain in housing and not lose that housing simply because they don't have the on-site supports that are necessary to be successful. The only other thing we'll talk about briefly is we need a continuum of housing. Right now within San Francisco, supportive housing providers are carrying a boatload of challenges within one set of housing. We're often seen as board and care for some, skilled nursing for others, and permanent housing for many. So we really need to take a look at how do we build out this continuum so that folks who need higher levels of care can actually access it and afford it, and not have to leave San Francisco, which is often the case because there is no affordable board and care housing within the city for folks to go into. We also need to look at housing that is respectful of the choices of the folks that we're serving. So if people are moving in and they're choosing to use substances, that is fine. How do we wrap supports around those folks so that they can keep their housing and not create issues for other tenants who are now frustrated and talking to the property management staff about why aren't you doing anything about this? I've submitted incident reports and nothing's happening. So it puts us as providers in the crossroads of trying to figure out how to maintain housing for everyone when we're working with various populations within supportive housing, some of whom need other levels of care that we cannot provide. But we are not also wanting to make people homeless simply because the supports are not there. So we're hopeful that our colleagues at Department of Public Health, Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, in addition to DOS, are able to work and partner with us and residents so that we can better figure out what this system of care needs to look like and the investments that need to be made to sustain the housing for the future. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last presentation, I wanted to invite up Cheryl Shanks, and thank you, Ms. Shanks, for your early engagement in this and your leadership on these issues, particularly in your work with Tenderloin People's Congress, and want to give you the floor.
Hello, my name is Cheryl Shanks. I'm a community organizer, activist, and a Tenderloin resident. I have lived in an SRO for 6 years. I thank all the presenters that you're willing to have this conversation with us. So, right to be free, unjust evictions, and to not be exiled back on the streets. Tenants should be able to rent, strike to address health, safety, and accessibility concerns. Many times people live in SROs. I know that I lived in an SRO with fungus on the wall for several years before they came and fixed it. That was out in the Bayview district. And when they did fix it, he did everything he could to get me kicked out. I should have been able to not pay rent at that time. Also, I wanted to say that many people that are living in buildings that I know personally are scared. They're scared to let the management know what is going on because many times the management does not follow the rules or the protocol because basically there's no oversight to make sure that they do that. So yes, tenants should be able to strike their rent and not pay. The supportive housing providers cannot evict for visitors policy violation unless the visitor or visitors were a substantial nuisance. Many times people which actually takes a person off the street, family members that are not allowed to stay with them overnight for many different reasons, and many times it's personal at the management discretion since there is no oversight for the management and they basically do what they want. People are being evicted for having family and friends overnight. Many times children that come to visit are also not allowed to stay, and when they find out that someone's child might be there, they might be evicted as well. People are being evicted for having boxes in their room during inspections and getting several notices, when in fact the rooms are so micro that there is no other place to store things. And they're being evicted and put out on the street. Public nuisance. I would say that, the proximity, the people are so close to each other, it's almost impossible for people not to hear the other people. And if people are in fact a nuisance, why I really believe that they should have their behavioral health possibly looked at and have resources to come in and assess the situation when there is not. I live in when a supportive housing provider posts a legal notice concerning eviction, the tenant should have resources posted with it as well. When people of color, especially, as we know, get put back on the street, it might take years and years and years for them to get a place to live again because of all the racism and discrimination going on. And it's not just people of color. It's also poor whites and everybody else involved in the system. Very detrimental to people's mental health to have to know that they could be put out on the street at any moment and people are being threatened with these notices. I was not allowed to let my dog without a leash, and I've got several notices, threats of eviction. I cannot walk downstairs when the elevators are not working, which happens quite often in TNDC building, holding my dog because I can be rolled down the stairs. From that, I can be rolled down the stairs. I also want to go back, I'm sorry, to overnights. In 2019, I worked at TNDC, and there was no uniform for overnights. Management, once again to their own discretion, was picking and choosing how many overnights they would have. The city policy says there should be 14 overnights uniform. And so I advocated for that, and that happened. But that's just to show how management is basically doing their own thing at these different SROs. And I'm a TNDC resident, so I can definitely say that is happening at TNDC. And people are suffering. People are suffering right now. Also back to evictions they're putting somebody out of the building because she didn't pay her rent before COVID. So they're going back on that. She is a TLGBTQ. I don't know if I said it right. I'm sorry. My mind's
Ms.
just
Shanks, I need to, the time is up, so if you want to wrap up, that's fine. I know we'll hear from
and she is a black woman, so for her to be put back on the street and being a black woman, I don't know what might happen to her, but it would probably take a long, long time for her to get a place again since there is no resources. It should have been prevented in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for your advocacy for this hearing. And so that wraps up the presentations. I did have some questions for maybe to start with HSH, if Deputy Director Cohen could come back up. So first off, you presented a slide around the number of evictions, and then a stat that shows, I think, 1.7% or something like that of people evicted. And I just wanted to, like, my sense is while that's technically true, it kind of understates the scope of evictions. And the reason I say that, in the annual report that's provided, there's a list of, the number of UDs filed, unlawful detainer actions, and then there's a smaller number of the people quote unquote evicted. And I think that's that's the smallest possible universe of evictions. I assume that's where, is that where a judgment is entered, or what is that column and that figure?
Yes. So thank you, Supervisor, for the question. So for 2022, just as an example year, we had 228 unlawful detainers that resulted in 142 evictions. So what is counted as an eviction is when somebody is removed from the unit or there's a court action to require someone to leave the unit.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely is the smallest.
Yeah, and let me just, I won't dwell on it. I just do want to suggest something in terms of future reports on this, that this is within tenant advocacy circles a always hotly contested issue. From the landlord side, they always want to look at the number of times like the sheriff actually comes out and removes someone, and that's an eviction, but everything else is somehow not counted as an eviction, right? I just, what I'll respectfully suggest is certainly anytime an unlawful detainer action is filed against someone, like that is an eviction. Arguably, and if you look at like rent board data on private housing, anytime a notice, a 3-day notice or a 30-day notice is served, that is considered an eviction. If you look at how evictions are defined, endeavors to recover possession, they're called under the rent ordinance, right? The mere service of the notice to quit is an eviction. So I would just, I think it's important when we're looking, the data is not inaccurate. I just think the definitions matter. And if we're going to say only a certain percentage are quote unquote evicted, but that leaves out a lot of people who are getting an unlawful detainer action or are getting a notice to quit, and they're just not fighting it and losing all the way through a judicial process. But the numbers are at least double. If you just look at UDs filed, it's about double. And then if you look at the number of notices to quit, which is the first step in an eviction process, I imagine it's much higher than that. So the scope of evictions is much broader, I think, than that number. And I think it would be helpful, like the rent board does, if the annual report could specify also if you track. Well, I guess the question is, could you do that? Do you track that? Do the providers report to you the number of notices they're serving?
Yes, Supervisor, thank you. They definitely report the unlawful detainers because that is in the report, and I believe they also report the notices. Just looking at it now. So we report on households with one or more written notices of eviction. We also report on the unlawful detainer filings, and then the executed lease.
Got it. Great. Thank you. So I think it'd be helpful to have the number receiving the notices of eviction, understanding that not every one of those results in someone losing their home. It may get resolved without someone being displaced, but that would be a useful figure to know sort of the scope of potential evictions.
For the last year, that was 3.83%, and then that led to the 1.29% actually evicted.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. And to your first question, the housing placement team includes 20 FTE. Some of those were reorganized from other parts of the department who were doing housing eligibility work. They are now part of that team, and then it's 2 temporary positions that are sunsetting soon. So it'll be 18 FTE.
Great. On eviction data, one other follow-up. In the eviction report, there is a comprehensive list of every supportive housing site and the eviction data. What the public doesn't see is by provider. And I'm curious if that's data that you follow and look for trends as to which providers are potentially engaged in more eviction or less eviction activity.
Absolutely. So we are in the process of revamping how we collect this data so that we're getting it real time rather than in a follow-up report. So under the new data collection process, we will be able to see it not just by building, but by provider, by reason, and be able to get that information on a monthly basis. So we're really looking forward to that. It is not in place yet, but that's coming in the near future.
Thank you. On the eviction practices and policies, I think, so last August, the Chronicle did a report on evictions in supportive housing, At that time, HSH did not have any kind of standardized eviction policies that, or minimum standards or policies that all supportive housing providers had to follow. There's a reference in that coverage that, and I quote, HSH is working on standardized eviction policies for all supportive housing providers. Assuming that's accurate, let us know if it isn't. I'm curious what the status of that is.
Absolutely. So what I think would be a more accurate statement is that HSH was working on a non-payment of rent guideline, so not evictions for every reason, but really focusing in on this newer challenge that we're facing, which is non-payment of rent, and we have issued those guidelines.
Got it. So in terms of evictions more broadly than non-payments, are there some minimum standards or contractual obligations that you apply to all supportive housing providers?
Yes. So we don't have a eviction policy per se, because that is really the purview of the landlord who holds the lease with the tenant. But each of our contracts with our permanent supportive housing providers for property management and for social services outlines the goal and the intent of supportive housing for eviction to be a absolute last resort, as is the language in the non-payment of rent guidelines. And we do talk about in the contract like how the provider should intervene and work with tenants if they are at risk of losing their housing. And then it's really up to the provider to determine how to implement that at their site.
Thank you. One of the, I can tell you, having defended a lot of evictions, that one of the big differences, even a very well-meaning provider may hand a case off to a not so well-meaning eviction lawyer. And we have some, let's just say, some more ethical than others of those who are doing evictions. I'm curious whether whether the providers report to you who they're using for evictions, and whether that information also could be part of the data that's provided in that big spreadsheet. Not just who the provider is, but what eviction firm they're using. I will tell you, having been on the defense side of these things, you will see patterns if you look.
I am sure. We could certainly, I can bring that back to the team as a recommendation for the future data collection effort on this. I don't think that is currently collected by us to the providers. I'm asking my provider colleagues. Thank you. Never seen it.
Okay, thank you. And then you were talking about the handoff. I want to get a little more clarity on what HSH is doing. You've mentioned the increased staffing around the housing placement teams. Can you clarify how the, coordinated entry is going through a bit of a redesign right now, right? So how does the redesign of coordinated entry address the issues of appropriate placements and greater visibility in PSH and for PSH providers?
That's a great question. I think we still have a lot of work to do on the implementation plan of the recommendations. The recommendations from the community are very focused on governance and oversight and the involvement of the community in the process, which we are very happy to move forward and advance. Currently, under coordinated entry, or under our housing placement process, a person experiencing homelessness would be assessed using a universal assessment tool, and then they will be matched with the most appropriate and available housing, right? It's often also based largely on what is available. They have 3 opportunities to decline that housing if it doesn't seem an appropriate fit, and then they are matched with a unit. They work with the housing navigator to get their documents in order. That usually actually happens first, and then they're matched with the unit. And then they go through the move-in process. I think what we're looking at under the new reforms of coordinated entry is less reliance on a focus on what's available and really focusing on what that person needs and trying to figure out how to make that placement more effective. Also looking at making transfers easier. Right now, transfers take a very long time and can be very challenging. And we know that a transfer can often mitigate an issue. If somebody's having an issue with their neighbor and it is escalating, and we want to avoid an eviction for both parties. A transfer is often the easiest solution for everybody involved, but the process takes too long and is very, very challenging. So that is one of the big things that we're trying to change with the invention of the housing placement team, that they can expedite that transfer process.
Got it. And when did coordinated entry start?
Started in about 2018 with veterans, and then we started doing it for families and then adults. It's phased in over many years. Maybe 2017 for veterans. 16? 14. Teresa is telling me 2014 for veterans.
8 years. Okay, I will just more as a editorial comment, and then I'll move on to a couple other questions, but just like the time, I mean, just the fact that I get why we moved to coordinated entry. There are some noble goals of doing that, and it is absolutely right that we are revisiting that. But some of these things that are kind of being launched now, 7, 8 years later, is really part of the problem, right? That if we're going to change to, if we're changing to a system where essentially the providers have no role in selecting who moves in, and where they're by the nature of the system going to have folks with greater acuity, but we don't have any real continuity of services, any real visibility of, sort of just starting anew where someone's placed, you end up with a situation. I mean, it's just not a surprise to anyone, certainly not to anyone who lives in an SRO or who operates an SRO, that you would have a lot of the issues that we're seeing, right? And that folks are bearing the brunt of that sort of lack of foresight and planning. So I don't put that on you, Deputy Director Cohen, but I do think it's like just to impress, and like we're 7 years behind when we should have been having this conversation, and it's good there's some progress, but there needs to be some urgency, I think, around that, because without it, we're not going to really be able to address some of the concerns we're talking about at the other end that then end up in eviction.
Yep.
Let me shift for a second to, and I don't know if this may be you, this may be Ms. Papo. Once someone is going to be displaced, there's an eviction action pending, perhaps a judgment was entered, it's become clear this person is moving, right? Can you address what HSH, DPH, or the expectation of providers are to make sure that that person is rehoused? And I don't want to hide my perspective on this, because as District 5 supervisor, and I'm sure other offices experience the same, we hear from the folks in SROs in that situation, and most of the time doesn't seem like there's a plan, and it's on our offices, which certainly aren't staffed to do this work, to literally either house the person ourselves or explain to them why the city doesn't have a plan for them. So what are we missing? What's the role of HSH, DPH, or any other city agency once it is clear someone is going to have to leave supportive housing to find a new housing option for them?
Yeah. Thank you, Supervisor. I think there's a lot of room for improvement in this area of the work. I think the providers do their best to ensure that somebody has a place to go. They are not immediately able to, if an eviction is executed and they've done everything in their power up until that point to prevent the eviction, but it does go forward, then often shelter is the only thing available for that person upon that eviction. And then we re-engage in the housing placement process with them. But there is not always a perfect safety net under the safety net when this happens. And our shelter system is there and is available for folks, but that is often the last resort that we have available.
Is there a program other than shelter that can be activated?
I'm going to turn it over to Dara, yeah.
So in thinking of the continuum of services, definitely shelter is a safe place that people can stay. The eviction process is oftentimes the time that people will be attempted to be referred to community resources. It's generally not been the first time that these resources would have been offered to somebody, but again, we want to keep on trying to connect them to case management, to substance use treatment, to residential treatment. And so sometimes this is the window of opportunity that somebody may say they'd be willing to try something, including something that might be a residential program that could also provide housing as well as care and treatment. If somebody's going to the shelter or shelter health system, which is nurses and behavioral health care can also be engaged. If somebody's going back to the community, an alert can be sent out to the street medicine team, community paramedics, to be able to identify them, try to engage them, and reconnect them back into our system of care and services. Again, lots of areas of opportunity and ways that people do fall through the cracks, but there are a number of sort of services that can help people land more softly.
Yeah, well, let me say, and I know we'll obviously be having ongoing conversations about this, so I don't want to dwell on this too much, but let me just observe that what you're describing is the more general approach, right? I mean, there are always attempts to try to provide the support, find, other. What we don't have, from my observation, is anything that is different once it becomes 100% clear that someone is about to, like the sheriff is coming next week on Wednesday, and someone is there it's Friday. Right? It seems like there's nothing, and other jurisdictions, frankly, I think do this better. I mean, I've just been learning about some of the work they're doing in Santa Clara with the Welcome Home program and other where they have folks who have more intensive needs, and as an eviction prevention response or a homelessness prevention response, in that situation will really elevate the placement of that person in somewhere where they have more support and their needs will be met. That really seems to be, it doesn't seem like the approach is any different. And I will say, without naming names, I will say thank you to those in these various departments who, even when it's not part of their job, take our desperate calls and help us try to figure out something so someone is not sleeping on the street. But the fact that we have to do it in that way, that there isn't a program in that window around placement of people who are at imminent, not just risk, where their eviction and displacement is a certainty, and they are going to either be on the street or in a shelter, and just sending them to a shelter to go right back through and start the system strikes me as not a satisfactory approach to folks who are often the most vulnerable and the most in need of services.
Thank you. You speak a lot to the need for care coordination, which is services that follow through multiple places they might be. And I know behavioral health, through the Office of Care Coordination, has a number of new teams where they can do that short-term sort of stabilization and linkage. But that is definitely something that there is no one specific program, as you spoke of right now. And we'll definitely take that back to our respective departments.
Thank you. And I think my last question for you before we move to my colleagues' questions or public comment is on if you could elaborate on the FACTS team. I understand it's now in effect for a year, right? Last March. But I'm not hearing about a lot of change resulting from that, so I'm trying to understand where things are with that program. We continue to hear about lack of support for residents with acute issues, also particularly in the evening hours and the weekends. I know is an ongoing problem when staffing on site is limited, right, from desk clerks and others. So can you talk about what DPH is doing to address those gaps, and then specifically just how the rollout of the FACTS team and program is going?
Thank you, Supervisor. That's a great question. The FACTS team launched literally about a year ago this month, and like new programs, it started with 10 buildings. Then about 5 to 6 months later, moved to 22 and went to the 69 buildings just about 2 months ago. So we haven't yet had impact on all of the buildings. And that is something that I'm hoping that as we are able to scale, there will be more individuals that are seeing the impact. And I think, again, with the number of buildings, there is a focus on capacity building and support for the on-site services staff, helping them identify for us who the highest acuity individuals are, that we could also engage in some in-home healthcare services.
Thank you. Looking forward to the reports of how that rollout is going. And that's it for my questions. And unless my colleagues have questions, maybe we can open for public comment.
Go ahead, Supervisor Preston.
I don't have questions. I appreciate, this has been something that's been on all of our minds for a long time, and I appreciate, Supervisor Preston, you're taking the lead in this. I did just want to thank Lauren Hall and Dish and a bunch of other folks, TNDC, Joe Wilson, and others for taking the initiative to meet with my office and Ms. Cohen and HSH relative to the narrow slice of dealing with vacancies and placements in a more expeditious time frame, and feel like we made some progress. I just wanted to thank all of you for doing that. It's related to this conversation. I mean, I can't help but noting the kind of tragic implications of the revolving door of going from PSH to shelter, standing back in line to get back into PSH. It's just, I realize this is all very, very complicated, but it kind of defies logic, but I realize it is tough and challenging.
Thank you, Supervisor. I did have one question, and I think it was the providers during the presentation. You talked about the need for a continuum of housing, how you are carrying like the whole thing from, supportive housing, board and care, and I'm wondering because, we just this past month approved a housing element for the city that commits us to adding a bunch of units to our housing stock, and half of it is supposed to be affordable. I'm, still wondering what the plan is and who's going to come up with that plan. So, we have this need of supportive housing, and I hear you loud and clear that it's, we should have X number in that need that's permanent supportive housing units, X number for board and care, X number for, whatever, in a continuum so that people can move to the appropriate housing and also free up the units that are needed for folks in that category. And so I know we had somebody here from the Mayor's Office of Housing, who is coming up with this so that we can match our, commitments. I don't know who that question is to. I mean, I know I heard it from you during the presentation, but, is anybody quantifying this? Are we? Yeah. Okay, I know there you are. Go ahead, Sheila.
Good afternoon. Sheila Nicolopoulos, Director of Policy with the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development. You're absolutely right that we need a huge diversity of affordable kinds of units to meet the breadth of need. I think right now we're struggling to meet the need that's in our pipeline. We're facing increasing challenges in securing state funding. Costs are continuing to rise. So while we work on addressing our immediate needs to get our pipeline moving as we want it to, we are starting the process of looking at how to implement the housing element. So this next month we'll be drafting recommendations based on the mayor's directive to try to begin that process of understanding how can we secure funding, where can we diversify the way that we fund things, and more importantly, too, how can we trim back on costs, whether through process or other mechanisms. It is a challenge, and we will do what we can to rise to it.
Thank you, Ms. Nicolopoulos. Okay, so seeing no more questions or comments, let's go to public comment. Madam Clerk.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Are there any members of the public who would like to speak on item number 2? Please line up to your right near the curtains. Those on the telephone line, please press *3 to be added to the queue if you have not done so already. And you have 2 minutes to speak. First speaker, please.
Hi, my name is Jean-Jacques Zenger. I'm 69 years old, and I'm a 40-year resident of San Francisco. I would primarily like to speak today on when it comes to support of Tenderloin Hotel tenants that I urge you to pass and put into law ways to stop evictions of residents and also to pass a Bill of Rights like they have for SROs in New York City. I'm going to try to tell my story today, and I'm also going to be here speaking for people that are now deceased or don't feel powerful enough to show up here today. I've lived in Conard House, supportive housing, for 4 years. And when I first got into an apartment in Conard, I brought in all my boxes that I had various places and in storage and thought that I finally had permanent housing. Conard House has turned out not to be very permanent. After several months, I was harassed about having boxes in my room and was told that basically it was a fire hazard and that I was a health and safety hazard. I had simultaneously discovered that the apartment I was in and was shared was basically had an infestation of mice, which I complained about to the property manager. We had 12 holes in the walls in different places that were not repaired. We had a fire extinguisher, of all places, in the kitchen that was dead and had a tag on it that had not been serviced in 10 years. We also had a broken refrigerator. The manager, in response to all of that, having notified him at least 3 times and in writing and orally processed to evict me. Conard then transferred me to the Midori Hotel in the Tenderloin. I have a problem with clutter. I'm not a hoarder clutterer. Everybody thinks that because they've seen the TV shows that they know what a hoarder clutterer is. I have major depression disorder that keeps me from processing what I have, and also when I have a really small...
Thank you so much for your comments. Your time has lapsed.
Wow. That doesn't sound like 2 minutes.
Next speaker, please.
Hi, my name is Tabitha Allen with Tenderloin Housing Clinic, and one of the things that I want to say that one of our core values at THC is to get and keep people housed, and I really try to enforce that is our goal from the day somebody is referred to THC until the day that they exit our buildings, and really trying to focus on what can we do to create housing stability and maintain somebody's housing. The groups that spoke today did a really great job of talking about that, but from housing retention conferences to reminder notices to outreach to tenants, setting up payment plans for all of the balances that people owe, making referrals to various resources, making referrals to complete applications for rental assistance, connecting tenants to third-party rent programs, a lot of different things. One of the challenges always is people have choice to accept those services, and we really do our best to try to engage them. I'm hopeful that with the investment from HSH and being able to increase our services and decrease caseloads to 1 to 25, I'm hoping we can better engage residents in those services. But just want to say that that is really a focus of ours as a housing provider, to really keep people housed. There was a question earlier just in terms of non-payment and the ongoing issues. And I wanted to say, while I don't have the overall balance still owed, I do, once the SFERAP funds were applied, and that period covers through August of 2022, I did figure out the gap between then and now. So between September of 2022, when that rental assistance gap period is over, through now, March 2023, we have 708 tenants that owe a collective $875,900. So that's ongoing after the ERAF funds have ended. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Next speaker, please.
My name is Carmen Barsotti, co-founder of Faithful Fools, and have lived and worked in the Tenderloin for the past 25 years. And we're community-based, so we have a lot of freedom to work with people in at various levels. And I personally became an IHSS worker in order to engage on a very personal level with people who were having issues in buildings. So one is I offer to talk with anybody about insight, because I get involved in a lot of the work when people are being threatened with eviction. And so we sit a lot with the managers or with the case managers trying to find solution. But I think so much of what was mentioned here in terms of the overload of work and just having people show up, punitive actions, having managers sit there and say, my real intention is to get you evicted, rather than to work with us on an individual. But I think one of the big issues that happens also is when we talk about the continuum of care is the need that we watched a great deal, especially when people were transitioning from the streets or hotels into housing, is we had people who were living in the buildings who had become stable and had been there many years. They were not struggling with addiction. And what we did was we brought people in from the streets with chaotic behavior that destabilized the whole building and many of the tenants. And when we are trying to call attention to that or to move people, they tell us we cannot move people into other buildings. We can only move them into another room, which does not address the issue that the building is struggling with, having tenants who have become stabilized over a number of years, and the insertion of people who need a stabilization period.
Thank you so much. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Ora Perchufnik, and I'm the Director of Litigation and Policy at the San Francisco Eviction Defense Collaborative. We're the lead agency in our Tenant Right to Counsel program. I'm here this afternoon to thank you for your oversight in this much-needed area of permanent supportive housing. Needless to say, I have a lot more to say than 2 minutes will allow, but I will try to talk very fast and be brief. I, in particular, want to echo the earlier comments on the importance of definitions. Numbers of evictions are very low if you only count when the sheriff throws you out, much higher if you count the unlawful detainer filings, and higher still if you count the services of notice. From the perspective of a tenant who's being housed, the trauma kicks in when you get that notice paper, and we need to start counting from that stage. And many people will self-evict, not knowing about their rights, and will move when they get paperwork when they don't need to. I also want to point out that the discrepancy between the much lower eviction by sheriff versus how many UDs were filed is in part due because of our tenant right to counsel, and that it's because of the very hard work of our eviction defenders that so many of those people are successfully remaining housed. That's a good thing, but the irony is not lost on me that our city is on the one hand paying a lot of money to our eviction defenders to keep people housed, while paying money to our service providers to hire law firms to throw those people out of their homes. There's got to be a better use of that money. Also, the earlier recommendation of looking at patterns is very important. We heard from DISH has a very different pattern of evicting than some of the other housers, the patterns by housers themselves, and the different counsel that they choose to hire. There's some really low-hanging fruit of way we could keep people more housed that I hope we look at. Limiting the number of people who are being evicted by default so that they have a chance to have their due process rights, making sure that our right to counsel program gets notices when the UDs are filed so that they could come in, stipulating to setting aside those, making evictions truly a last resort and not a behavior modification tool.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you, supervisors. I'm Chris Calandrello. I'm the Chief Program Officer for Episcopal Community Services. ECS is a member of the Supportive Housing Providers Network, and we agree with their presentation. The woman before me just talked about the cost of evictions. We should be funding people's full rent, so we don't have to evict for non-payment of rent. Right? We've got the money in the system to be able to do so, and eviction is hugely expensive. People pay $50, $100, $120 in rent a month, which means nothing on the individual level, but for the building, that revenue can be upwards of $200,000 a year. On our already stretched operating budgets, we can't afford to lose that revenue, but you can find a way to put it into the system so that we can guarantee that folks won't be evicted for non-payment of rent. And I think that's my primary point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next speaker.
Hi, my name's Pauline Levinson. I was evicted from the Jefferson SRO. I went all the way through what was supposed to be a trial. I had somebody from the EDC who was representing me. It turned out to be a kangaroo trial, and I was served notices that were supposed to be filed in divorce papers by Harold Olson. They switched attorneys in the middle. I mean, I couldn't keep up with it. The judge in my case, Susan Reardon, she at one point said that all notices and motions must be given to me by 11 today. And we were in court by noon today, and we were in court. The other side had the manager of the building sitting there typing something away, and here comes the discovery that they hadn't provided me, filing through. So I had no shot at all. Since being evicted, I've been sexually assaulted twice. I've been nearly killed. I've been beat over the head. I mean, I can't even tell you the. I had 26 calls to the police saying that I was making noise in the month of September of last year. Looking at the CAD reports, I was in Florida visiting my parents who had just moved there. Okay, the police do show up to these complaints of someone making noise or moving furniture, at 7 o'clock at night, and I would get so angry with the police because they are coming in to handle these civil matters, and they're using the color of law to evict people, to harass people. It's because I was complaining about the conditions there. I was calling the public health department. I was recording and documenting everything that was going on. We have case managers that are acting as property managers. It's insane. It's a vulnerable population, and there are no social workers or no mandated reporters that are there to oversee the conditions that they're forcing people to live in.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Hello, my name is Laura Sinai, Tenderloin People's Congress. My friend Cheryl Shanks, a well-known community organizer here, has been contained here in the Tenderloin in her SRO. She's tried to get help to go to the next level. There is no ladder where she can go where she has been. She has disabilities, and again, there's the elevators out, which it is most of the time. I visit her there. It's hard for her to get to her floor. There's just, there's a lot of reasons why at this stage of her life that she should be contained in this particular hotel. And she has tried through different nonprofits and whatnot, TNDC included, to get another place to live that it would be more appropriate for her. And it's an extremely difficult battle that she's doing. Also, people should not be evicted because they can't pay rent. A lot of times, like the other lady just said, it doesn't seem fair for the way people are being evicted. There has to be more oversight. There has to be policy change. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. Next speaker.
Hi, my name is Royce Anderson. I'm just going to read from my phone, so I keep it short. I live in supportive housing at the Pacific Bay Inn, which is located at 520 Jones Street. I've been there for 8 years, I think. I'm on the community advisory board for my building, and I consider it a great honor. First and foremost, I want to applaud Lauren Hall and her team at DISH for their tireless efforts housing San Francisco's many homeless, for being a very real part of the solution. That being said, I just wanted to share my experience in living in a community of formerly homeless individuals where, while not the norm by any stretch, I've witnessed instances of violent and greatly disturbed behavior from tenants, lighting campfires in their rooms, throwing microwave ovens out their windows, 5 stories up. I've been a neighbor to individuals whose conditions were so acute that they pose a very real threat to the safety of others living in my building. And while I agree with the vision statement at DISH that everyone deserves a home, sometimes my belief, evictions are not just appropriate but necessary. Where do one person's rights end and another's begin? Everyone has a right to feel safe in their own home.
Thank you so much. Next speaker.
Good afternoon. My name is Jordan. My pronouns are she, her. I've been doing a lot of supportive housing advocacy for a really fucking long time. 2017, I was appointed to the SRO task force. In 2015, before that, I was placed in Tenderloin Housing Clinic, which is one of the worst fucking evictors in this city. Not only that, but they still managed to get contracts for new buildings, and they still managed to run their community, run the Central City SRO Collaborative. And I've had to literally fight for justice for our tenants. I'm glad that we're getting sunshine on this now. It wasn't until 2019 when I had to hunger strike to get a basic eviction protection measure, the 30% in rents for all supportive housing, that this shit started to happen. And then, of course, the Chronicle exposés kept happening. The excellent Chronicle exposés. It's 2023, and I'm not going to belabor the point. There's so much fucking shit I could say, but I want to say that you need to treat tenants as equal partners here. Yes, I know that there's some issues with other tenants' behavior, but that can be dealt with. We need a continuum of housing. We need real housing justice. We need this to be a layered approach. We need to stop harassing people over oh, your room's disorganized, or whatever other bullshit the fucking providers are saying. So it's just really bad, and we need to be equal or senior partners in all of this, because I've been threatening with eviction before, and it needs to fucking stop, and there needs to be accountability for providers. So to all those providers who just don't fucking care about stopping evictions, I yield my time. Fuck you.
Thank you so much. Next speaker.
Hi, my name's Elizabeth Ann Missamore. November 8th of 2002, I was a single parent of 3 living in the Tenderloin, and CPS removed my children from me, which was really difficult, was mentally, but I overcame that. But in January of 2003, I went into homelessness, and I did 16 years in the shelters, and then I had 3 SROs in between that, from GA, workfare, and I was evicted from all 3 of those SROs. I've overcame all that, and now during COVID, Dish Network came to me at the next door or Site S Navigation Center and placed me. I've been housed for a year and a half now, since July 23rd of 2021, and I'm in a really nice building, and I'm a community advisory board, and Dish Network also helps people to keep their housing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next speaker.
Hello, my name is Fred Sherburne-Zimmer from Housing Rights Committee. Thank you for calling this hearing. I hope you really listen to tenants. Evictions and supportive housing are a problem, and that the process and the support is radically different from nonprofit to nonprofit. What happens at one is totally, utterly different than what happens at another. During the pandemic, almost half of evictions were from supportive housers, and of those, 50% were African American tenants. This is a racial justice issue. Housing Rights has been asking these orgs for the following set of changes to reduce evictions. Train every staff person top to bottom in de-escalation skills. Often staff escalates problems. Try to resolve issues at the lowest level before sending it to a lawyer. Often the lawyer can be the problem. Stop broad stipulations. EDC talked more about that. Transfer before you evict. Provide support in supportive housing, especially to new and struggling tenants. let your tenants organize and form independent tenants councils. And I have to say there's a second piece of this, which I think the city's at fault for, not only holding the nonprofits' feet to the fire, but also the city is at fault if it doesn't provide the money for the supportive services in supportive housing. It doesn't provide the money to properly train staff, and that wages are so bad that turnover is off the hook, and that these tenants deserve decent housing, and you need to really listen to them. And thank you so much for having this hearing today.
Thank you for your comments. Next speaker.
Good afternoon, Board of Supervisors. My name is Joy. I won the lottery in 2017, thinking that I was upgrading my life from all the time I've lived in San Francisco. I've been living in regular rent control apartments. I won the lottery and moved into a TNDC building, and it's been a nightmare from hell. I'm in senior living, and I can't believe what a disaster and mistake I made. I was without hot water from December 2021 to 7 months till about April, May, with no hot water, and all I was told is no one else in the building is complaining but you. I called the building inspector, and they got a write-up and a violation. Next thing I knew, I was repeatedly burglarized in my apartment. I swear I am not lying. My laptop was taken, my jewelry was taken, and I have had no visitors before COVID. And no one stepped foot in my door but me. And there's no tampering to my lock on my door. Then after that, I was given a 10-day notice of nuisance because I started yelling that I was having problems. I was vocalizing my anger. And that turned into getting 2 10-day notices, and then going into eviction. I am now in the unlawful detainer moment. They are trying to settle with me, and I am going to court, and I'm fighting to the end. This is wrong, wrong, wrong. And Wrong Wong in TNDC needs to be fired. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, supervisors. Liza Morawski, community mental health advocate. I heard a lot of talk around proper case management and the need for proper assessments. Yet we continuously see evictions in supportive housing due to the lack of support. It seems apparent that our coordinated entry has not been effective for over 7 years. We constantly, we're going to have the data. Here's a new program. Where's the database? Where's the dashboards? We were able to get them in COVID like that. This is not acceptable, and especially when mental health is on the rise. Our sites are funded to provide support, yet all the contracts are in violation with culturally responsive support. The sites are understaffed, and the staff is underpaid. Living in these conditions often cause so much trauma from the management and the lack of support that the individuals digress physically and mentally. Yet again, they become the victims of their challenges. That is not okay. Thank you. I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Hello, my name is Christopher Micah. I just want to, first off, I want to co-sign some things that people have said, particularly Pauline and some others. There's a lot of retaliation. Eviction is always on the table. I think Pauline spoke to that, and so have many others. So I want to put that out there. Again, I'm an SRO supportive housing tenant in the Tenderloin. I want to thank you for having this hearing. I've not been subjected to eviction by my supportive housing SRO landlord, but I have witnessed and been subject to threats of eviction. At the latter part of COVID lockdown, the day before the Board of Supervisors extended the eviction moratorium, my landlord, Tenderloin Housing Clinic, sent pay or quit notices to each tenant in my building that tenants must pay months of back rent accumulated during the shutdown. When I went to go speak to my building's case manager to address this, he told me that I must immediately set up a repayment plan with my landlord and start paying my back rent immediately. Note that this same case manager was the one who had helped me apply for COVID rent relief and knew that my relief application was pending. Suffice to say, I did not set up a payment plan. With the assistance of Eviction Defense Clinic, I was able to advocate for myself, and I sent my landlord a very clear and strongly worded letter pointing out the fact that my rent relief application and the law, my landlord left me alone. In the spring, my rent relief application was approved. I'd like to point out that I had been intimidated. Had I been intimidated into signing a repayment plan, I would have put myself in a position where I was more vulnerable to eviction. And furthermore, there are many people in my building who are not able to advocate for themselves as aggressively as I am able to. Why was my landlord sending pay or quit notices to tenants during COVID in the first place? I quickly tell this story to illustrate one of the ways my landlord, through the tools of eviction, sets tenants up for jeopardy. Thank you.
Next speaker, please.
Hello, my name is Cheryl Shanks. Here I am again. I wanted to tell you a little bit of...
Sorry, I got to cut you off since you presented. I don't think you can give public comment as well. Sorry.
I am.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the rule.
Next speaker, please.
Hi, my name is Leah McGeever. I'm just here to support all of these people who do not deserve to be treated like this. No one deserves this. And also, these are the experts. So if you're going to fix this, consult their expertise and pay them for it. You don't always know when homelessness or potential homelessness is going to strike you or a loved one. And I didn't know that it could potentially strike my father, who is a veteran and disabled and in poor health, until this year. And so it is very traumatizing and shocking when that happens. Maybe it'll happen to you or a loved one this year as well. So I just hope you have the urgency to solve this as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Hello, supervisors. Thank you for and thank you for calling this hearing today. It's so important. My name is Curtis Bradford. I'm a former supportive housing tenant for over a decade, and Tenderloin resident and co-chair of the Tenderloin People's Congress. And I just want to say I really support all the comments we've heard today. The residents of public supportive housing, they need to be, our permanent supportive housing, they need to be at the table. They need to be equal partners in all of the discussions, because they're the ones that actually have the solutions to the challenges that we're discussing here today. And if they're not at the table, we're never going to get it right. And secondly, I want to say that, good example, the Tenant Bill of Rights. And if you want to see SRO Tenant Bill of Rights, and if you want to know more about that, Jordan would be happy to explain more of it to you. And we can share a copy of that with you as well. New York is a great example of what that could look like. And I think there's some real solutions there. Thirdly, we need to interrupt that process between imminent eviction and going to the shelter. That should just never happen. That should not be a solution. Going to the shelter should not be the answer. Going back to the street is where a lot of these folks actually end up. We got to do better, and we know that there's a process for doing that. We can intervene at that place and prevent that from happening. Seniors should not be being thrown out of their place with nowhere to go. And Dean, you shouldn't have to be housing people just because the system can't figure it out. So we need a better solution. And lastly, I just want to say that, I feel like, we gotta find. I'm gonna stop there. All right, but thank you. We can do all.
You have 30 seconds.
Sir,
you have 30 seconds. Oh, thank you so much. Are there any other members that would like to speak in the chamber for this item? Seeing none, we'll go to the remote call-in line. We have 14 listeners with 8 in the queue. Let's take the next caller, please. We have 2 minutes. You have 2 minutes. Hello, caller. Jeanette, if you can cue in the caller, please.
Hello, this is Anoxel Rama. I'm a public supportive housing resident and organizer with Senior Disability Action. I've benefited from supportive housing interventions and seen its failures. I have experienced mental illness, disability, and chronic homelessness. I've seen the benefits and failures firsthand organizing in SROs. Common in all of our experiences is that eviction and containment in unsafe housing conditions equals death. Does anyone ask what happens to the individuals we evict? Follow up on whether they are able to restabilize or do they die? Does anyone here look them in the eye when they are back out on the street destitute? We should. Death or jail is not the answer supportive housing residents will accept. One of the most common reasons I know of threats of eviction are around community living issues that would be resolved if poor people had the same right of housing choice and mobility as everyone else. If you could move down the hall, floor, another building, another neighborhood, then a lot of community conflict issues could be resolved. But we don't have mobility and fluidity in the system, and it creates a quirk, stagnation, and conflict. We don't have intensive supportive housing in the system, so people are placed to fail. It's an endless cycle that ends in death. We are creating all these middle management level supports that don't work. Maybe we should give the money directly to the people or ensure it's going to the people directly serving residents to improve their quality of life. Please listen to the solutions put forth by public supportive housing residents and include housing mobility and fluidity in the mix. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for your comments. Next speaker, please. You'll hear the system indicate you have been unmuted and you have 2 minutes.
Hi, my name's Ryan. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. My name's Ryan Murphy. I'm the Deputy Director of Litigation at the Eviction Defense Collaborative. It's part of the Tenant Right to Counsel program. I've personally represented many of these supportive housing tenants in eviction cases over the years. We all know that in order to qualify for one of these residencies, there has to be a history of chronic homelessness, substance abuse, physical and mental disabilities. And as we've heard repeatedly, when HSH allows housing providers to evict these tenants without any regard where the tenant will go after they're evicted. And where do they go? They return to street homelessness often. This needs to stop immediately. This is an urgent problem. To me, the solution is relatively simple. City-funded housing providers perhaps can evict if absolutely necessary, but before they do, they and HSH need to find secure alternative housing that's safe and decent. I hear from landlords in court all the time, we don't want to evict, but this tenant needs a higher level of care that we can provide. And whether or not that's true, we need to give them that level of care. And you can't put the onus on tenants who, mind you, are most often getting evicted for the untreated medical issues and reactions to trauma that qualifies them for this housing in the first place. Put the onus on HSH and the housing providers. They're getting millions of dollars, taxpayer dollars every year. If tenant needs higher level of care, HSH is best equipped to find that next place to go, not the tenant in crisis. Don't just continue this revolving door. Street homelessness, it's more than just a program failure. Because again, with hundreds of millions of dollars we're putting into this, it's more than a program failure because it's cruel and it's dangerous. Frankly, I mean, we've heard already from public comment today of people that have suffered horrible traumas subsequent to being evicted. Again, it's an urgent and health and safety issue.
Thank you so much for your comments. Your time has lapsed. Let's take the next caller, please. You have 2 minutes.
Assalamu alaikum, supervisors. My name is Leen Gash, and I live in Lower Nob Hill. I'm calling to thank you for calling this meeting, and I'm asking you to support the proposal for a 60-day wind-down period of the eviction process that our own city department of rent relief says it needs. I am a senior, queer, disabled, Hispanic, Muslim tenant. I have limited mobility, and I have lived here for almost 30 years. I think that 60-day wind-down for us to plan
Madam
for...
Clerk, I think this is for the next, sorry to interrupt, but I think that's public comment for the next item.
Oh, thank you so much, Supervisor.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you.
We are on item number 2. This is the hearing on the city's permanent supportive housing project-based sites item. Let's take the next caller. You'll hear you've been unmuted and you have 2 minutes.
Hi, this is Lux Crumpler from the Eviction Defense Collaborative Social Work Department. And the number one evictors are permanent supportive housing. And I can't tell you how frustrating it is to have a client sit across from you and cry thinking that they might return to homelessness. These are people who have been chronically homeless, and this is supposed to be permanent supportive housing. You need to expand what a transfer looks like. A life safety transfer is bullshit right now. I mean, it minimizes our ability to be able to transfer people within the program so that they can get away from issues that are causing whatever nuisance allegations they have. I mean, among that, these community-based permanent supportive housing people aren't trained and are underfunded greatly. So you're getting a bunch of poor people to serve other even poorer people without the resources or income they need to be able to live full lives, to be able to come present every single day of their life. That's fucking hard work. So you expect people to show up every day and give their all, and they could barely feed their own fucking families. This is an institutional issue, and it's a fucking issue about racism. I mean, most people that they're evicting are Black people, and let's just be real about it. It's people of color, and this shit needs to end. I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you so much. Next caller, please.
Yes, hello. My name is Armando. I'm calling in. Well, first things first. Good afternoon, supervisors. My name is Armando. I live in Nob Hill, and please support your proposal. Please support the proposal to create a 60-day wind-down period of the evicted protections. This prevents. Well, yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to say that there's a disconnection between the city and the landlords and the tenants. There's so much going on, especially after the pandemic has sort of wind down. It seems like the world was ramped up to accelerate to get back to normal, and there was a disconnection about how things were going to get handled and worked, and that it caused a backlog with how things were being processed. I just wanted to say off the bat that my experience with this whole process has been more than just stressful, actually very traumatic. And, we have our reasons why we do these things, landlords, the tenants, and the organizations that help the tenants and the lawyers that help mitigate these issues. But I think that, we're such at a place in the world where we're fighting over resources and we're fighting over, land, and we're fighting over all these things where we really come to realize that it's about the people. And, without the people, there really can't be a world and there really can't be, society. So I just want to say that if we're able to extend this, it would be great. And I end my speech there. It's about, respect. It's about understanding each other. And we all have our stories. We don't know what war we have going on inside of us. And when we are we're almost going into war. We're going into World War III. I mean, I might say it's going to happen, but look around. Is this what we want?
Thank you so much. Your time has lapsed.
Want?
Again, this is item number 2. If you would like to speak, you just need to press *3 if you have not done so already. Otherwise, we'll take the last caller in the queue.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sam. Thank you, supervisors, for having this meeting. I know everyone is going through a difficult time, especially when interest rate is in a rise, and eviction is something we should all take seriously. As in this matter, I'm a hardworking young man coming out from New York. There's times I work 6 jobs or more. I cannot even spend time with my family because I got to work to not get evicted. But with the stage of what evicted is going on right now with COVID-19 on the rise, and I would have to say, if the banks are able to get bailout, why us humans are not able to get a bailout? I think that we should extend this eviction and pause it and see what other better resource. Because the banks are right now, they facing a hard time. And we cannot trust the bank. And why? Well, I think that we count on you guys, supervisors, to think logically and say, okay, we need to slow down. Interest rate is 5%. It may be increasing tomorrow on Wednesday. I think we should just slow down and think about put the human kindness, because living in San Francisco is very difficult. And that's all I got to say. And I hope you guys will think about it and then do a extension, because we have older folks and that getting eviction. And we should just pause it and see what's better resources that we could give to the elderly folks, and especially me, not able to have time to spend with my family because we're getting notices of getting evicted. That's all I got to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's take the next caller.
Good afternoon, Soups. My name is Dana Ray Capizano, and I am here to respectfully request that you please support this proposal to create a 60-day grace period for the eviction protections. That's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Actually, that was for the next item. We're on item number 2. Item number 3 is the Administrative Code COVID-19 tenant protections. Let's take the next caller. Again, we are on item number 2 for evictions and permanent supportive housing project-based sites.
Hello?
Hello, you're on the line.
Me? You are talking to me because I hear different voices.
Yes, ma'am. You're on the line.
Okay. Yes. Good afternoon, supervisors. My name is Edith Pineda, and I live in San Francisco in the Sunset area for more than 20 years. I asking you please to support the proposal to create a 60-day wind-down period of eviction protection.
Ma'am, I'm going to stop you. We're actually on item number 2. This is the evictions and permanent supportive housing hearing. That's the next item. So if you can just press *3 to leave the queue, and then when we get to that item, you can press *3 again, and that completes.
So I need to.
Jeanette, if you can mute, please. We will return. We will get to item number 3. Right now, we're currently on item number 2. So when we call item number 3, you can press *3. That completes the queue, Madam Chair.
Okay, great. So public comment on this item is now closed. Supervisor Preston, did you have any closing remarks?
Yes, and just quickly before I wrap up, do we have an answer during this time from HSH or anyone on the total? We heard from Tenderloin Housing Clinic on their numbers. Thank you for sharing those of how much rent debt was owed and is outstanding. Do we have that information from, I don't know if Deputy Director Cohen is still here and has that information? Or I see Mr. Ramirez. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Hugo Ramirez with the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development. PSH providers are in the process of determining the unpaid rent, the outstanding unpaid rent, and SFERAP, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, excuse me, will coordinate access to financial assistance once we have that.
Okay. Thank you.
So we don't have that.
You don't. And so I just want to say, but I've been asking everyone from providers to city for this number. I appreciate that individually providers have it, but it seems pretty key to me to we should be having a no eviction right now during the COVID pandemic for back rent, unless we're out of rent relief money or there's some, we can as a body decide, and the administration can decide whether we're funding all that or not. But it is my understanding that some providers are not moving forward with evictions around non-payment, and some have begun to move forward with evictions around non-payments. That is a immediate threat and a problem and I do not get for a second why nobody is presenting these departments with total figures and saying, instead of moving forward with evictions, if you will pay this amount, we will not be moving forward with those evictions. So I don't know, I see maybe Ms. Garner or Ms. Hall, if you have an answer, that would be great.
Provided the information to the departments. There are residents who do not want to apply, and we cannot apply on their behalf without their consent. And so, again, we can try to pull that data. I know that we've applied for millions of dollars of funds, and we have about a little over 1 million. I feel like it's still pending. Sorry, I'm trying to remember Nick's email. But again, we can try to pull that, but we have I think there's been a pretty concerted effort on the part of the supportive housing providers to apply for every dollar that we could for residents who are willing to have us apply on their behalf.
And let me just say, because I feel that there has been some sort of everyone talking past each other on this issue, because I understand what you're addressing is the number of tenants who have applied and have pending applications, and then MoCD has that information around pending. There's a bigger policy question, which is forget whether someone has applied or not. What is the total amount? Take a given building or a given provider. What are we talking about? Are we talking about a total, the whole thing is $2 million, $3 million, $5 million? What is that number that would basically make the providers whole and have zero evictions going forward for non-payment during this COVID emergency? That, to me, there's a question whether there's a political will to cut that check. And I understand you've all been told that the way the provider should handle it is through individual tenant applications. But when we're looking at the number of people facing potential eviction here, if some of the providers who are moving forward move forward, I think there's a very serious question for the administration and the board and the mayor of whether, with $24 million in the bank unspent for rent relief, whether we want to use that to simply wipe out those debts without relying on individual applications. And again, this is not a state program where we have to do it a certain way. This is San Francisco money, and we can choose to use it in that way. So if we can get that figure, that not what's pending in applications, but what's the total rental debt that would make the providers whole and take eviction for non-payment completely off the table for this period, anything up till now, that would be very helpful.
So I think we can try to get at least for the SHPN members and get that back to you. But again, we can't speak to the larger, if anyone's not a member, but we'll certainly get that to you so you have a good ballpark.
Great. And again, it's not my unilateral call whether those funds are, we'll get that number and then we can have the conversation with the departments of whether it will be used in that way. Thank you. And thank you, Chair Melgar, for the time on this. I will just wrapping up, I've addressed the non-payment issue. I think we've talked that through. We shouldn't be evicting anyone for non-payment right now, in my opinion, with these rent relief funds available. I think we need to lean into the eviction, what guidelines we're providing to providers. I understand that was discussed in terms of non-payment, but I think more broadly, we're funding supportive housing. We should insist on certain practices around evictions and potentially look at who we're funding to the extent any of those dollars are going to eviction lawyers. Look at whether we're funding some of the worst bad apples or not in San Francisco. I think that we've also discussed some data improvements that I hope we'll see around both listing the providers and the attorneys in the annual eviction report, as well as looking at the definition of eviction. I think a number of folks, including Ms. Petrovnik from Eviction Defense Collaborative, have spoken to the a more inclusive definition of what evictions are, so that we're really capturing the impact in the reports. And I want to say that while evictions plummeted in the pandemic, I mean, it's been a success story in terms of reducing evictions. I think by 75% drop in San Francisco during the pandemic. We haven't seen such big reductions in terms of PSH evictions other than the non-payment evictions. And so that is part of the concern, and I think the call to all of us to make some of the changes we've been discussing, in particular the handoff, the ongoing support that's been discussed, and also this idea of some kind of emergency support at the end of the line in terms of placement, so that we're not doing this kind of cycle of folks getting evicted, going to the streets or the shelter, and then back in through the system. So with that, I really want to thank all the speakers, particularly PSH residents, the tenants who've come and spoken, Ms. Garner and Ms. Hall, and the providers who have met with us and have been partners in trying to figure out how to address some of these issues, and then the HSH DPH, and OCD for their engagement. I would like to continue this to the call of the chair, if that's okay, Chair Melgar, because I think, especially with some of these newer programs launching, we may want to come back and look at this again. Thank you.
Of course. So let's continue this to the call of the chair.
And on that motion, Supervisor Peskin?
Aye.
Peskin, aye. Supervisor Preston?
Aye.
Preston, aye. Supervisor Melgar?
Aye.
Melgar, aye. You have 3 ayes.
Thank you. And thank you, Supervisor Preston, and thank you to the community for coming out on this. So, Madam Clerk, let's go to item number 3, please.
Item number 3 is an ordinance amending the administrative code to extend by 60 days the restrictions on evicting or imposing late fees on residential tenants who could not pay rent that continue during the COVID-19 emergency. Members of the public who wish to provide public comment on item number 3 should call the number 415-655-0001. The meeting ID today is 2482-057-2196. Then press pound and pound again. And if you have not done so already and you would like to speak for item number 3, please press star 3. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Supervisor Preston, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Melgar, and thank you for calendaring this. Thank you, President Peskin, for waiving the 30-day rule so we could get this to committee as soon as possible. And thank you, Chair Melgar, for scheduling it as a committee report. So before us is, I think, the 14th and maybe what's the final piece of legislation